My name is Chloe Vance. I'm 23 years old, and 3 days ago, I held my grandfather's hand while the monitor flatlined, alone in a Boston hospital room at 2:47 in the morning because the two people who share his last name couldn't be bothered to answer a phone. They made it for the will reading, though. Funny how that works. The study smelled like him still. Cedar and old paper and something faintly chemical. The ghost of 100 late nights in the lab down the hall. Beakers warming. Arthur muttering equations under his breath while I brought him chamomile tea he always forgot to drink. 6 years of that smell, 6 years of that house being the only place on earth that felt like it had walls. Now, Richard and Eleanor Vance were standing in the middle of it in their London wool, touching things. My mother, and I use that word the way you'd use a label on a jar with nothing in it, was running her finger along the edge of Arthur's mahogany desk. Not reverently, assessingly, the way a real estate agent does when they're calculating what the staging will cost. She'd had her hair blown out, full makeup, at 9 a.m. for a will reading. She looked like she was attending a ribbon-cutting ceremony for something she already owned. My father stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at Beacon Hill like he was the one who'd earned the view. He had the particular posture of a man who has spent decades being important in rooms, and he carried it everywhere like luggage he couldn't check. He was 48 now. I'd missed that birthday. I'd missed all of them since I was 17. Their attorney, a man named Whitfield, from a firm on Park Avenue whose letterhead I'd Googled the night before, was opening his briefcase on the side table. Slim, silver-haired, the kind of lawyer who doesn't talk much because he charges $1,100 an hour and knows that silence costs you less. I sat across from all three of them in a plain black dress I'd worn to Arthur's last conference presentation 8 months ago. He'd introduced me to the room as the sharpest data mind I've trained in 40 years, and I'd stared at my shoes because that kind of thing still embarrassed me. I thought about that introduction now. I let it sit somewhere steady inside my chest. Evelyn Stone, the estate executor and Arthur's trust attorney of 19 years, set a laptop on the center table and entered a 12-digit access code from memory. She didn't introduce herself to Whitfield. She didn't need to. The two of them had already communicated everything necessary through the particular way they didn't look at each other. "We're ready," Evelyn said. "Let me back up 6 years, because none of what happens in this room makes sense without that math. I was 17 when my parents sat me down in the kitchen of our Chestnut Hill house, a house, I would later learn, with 3 mortgages on it, and told me they were relocating to London. Richard had secured an executive partnership at a private equity firm. Eleanor was joining as VP of Operations. It was, they explained with the flat enthusiasm of a corporate memo, a significant opportunity. "You'll be staying with Grandpa Arthur," my mother said. She was already looking at her phone. "For how long?" I asked. My father picked up his coffee. He could use the company. That was it. That was the conversation. No timeline, no discussion. I was a logistical detail that had been resolved. I remember the specific way the chair scraped when my father stood up from the table. That sound has lived in my body ever since, in the exact place where a different kind of parent might have left something warmer. I arrived at Arthur's brownstone on Beacon Hill with 2 suitcases and the specific, heavy numbness of a person who has just understood that they are not, and perhaps never were, the point. Arthur opened the door in a MIT alumni sweatshirt, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and looked at my 2 bags. Then at me. His jaw worked for a moment. "You like data?" he said finally. "I'm good at math," I said. "Good." He picked up one of my suitcases. "I have 17 years of patent research that needs organizing. Come in." That was the beginning of everything. Here's what no one in this room with their London wool and their Park Avenue briefcase understands about Arthur Vance. He was not a soft man. He didn't take me in out of sentiment. He was a biomedical engineer who had spent 50 years building systems designed to outlast human error, and somewhere in the first 6 months of our living arrangement, he decided I was worth building into one of those systems. He didn't coddle me. He assigned me work. Real work. Data architecture, patent classification, clinical trial outcome analysis. He corrected my methodology without softening it. He also, quietly and without ceremony, set up a desk in the corner of his lab that had good light and made sure there was always food in the house, and never once made me feel like a burden he was tolerating. Those are small things. I know they're small things, but when you've been made to feel like a line item, small things are the entire ledger. By the time I was 19, I was running the data infrastructure for 3 of his active patent licensing agreements. By 21, I had co-authored 2 research papers under his name. By 23, I knew his work the way a person knows their own handwriting. The rhythm of it, the logic, the places where his thinking turned unconventional and brilliant and slightly ahead of what the industry was ready for. And I had not heard from my parents in 6 years. A birthday text, twice. A Christmas card once, with no note inside. That was the entirety of their interest in me. If you've ever been left somewhere and told, through silence and absence, that staying was your problem now, drop a comment, because what I'm about to tell you is for you specifically. Back in the study, Evelyn clicked something on the laptop, and the room's small Bluetooth speaker, Arthur's, the one he used to play Coltrane in the mornings, emitted a short tone. Then his voice filled the room. I had heard Arthur Vance speak 10,000 times. In the lab, at conferences, across the dinner table arguing about zoning policy and protein folding and the structural failures of the American healthcare billing system. But hearing his voice in that room 3 days after the monitor flatlined was a different kind of experience. It pressed on something behind my sternum that I wasn't prepared for. He'd recorded this 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks before the end. His voice was measured, dry, precise. Exactly him. This is the Arthur Vance Irrevocable Trust, executed in its final form on the 14th of this month. If you're hearing this in the presence of Richard and Eleanor Vance, I'll note for the record that I expected as much. Punctuality in grief is a reliable indicator of financial interest. Let's proceed. My mother's chin came up slightly. My father's hands, still clasped behind his back, tightened. Whitfield's pen hovered over his legal pad. Evelyn Stone looked at none of them. She looked at her screen and let Arthur's voice do the work he'd designed it to do. The brownstone creaked around us, the way old Boston houses do in October, a sound like the building itself settling into something it had been waiting to say. I kept my hands flat on my knees. I kept my face still. I had known Arthur Vance for 6 years. I had watched him build things, patent systems, research structures, legal frameworks, with the specific patience of a man who understood that the most important work is invisible until the moment it isn't. He had been building this for 3 years, while his heart failed. While Richard and Eleanor sent Christmas cards with no notes inside. He had been building this for me. The speaker played on. Evelyn's terminal unlocked a second layer of encrypted documents. Whitfield leaned forward almost imperceptibly, and in the cedar and chemistry smell of Arthur's study, with October pressing gray against the windows, the architecture of what my grandfather had constructed began to reveal itself, one precise, irrevocable layer at a time. The second layer of the encrypted terminal took 43 seconds to unlock. I know, because I counted. Not deliberately. It was the kind of thing my brain does automatically. The data analyst in me measuring intervals the way other people drum their fingers. 43 seconds of the room holding its breath. 43 seconds of Whitfield's pen making small, meaningless circles on his legal pad. 43 seconds of my mother standing at the edge of the Persian rug Arthur had bought in Istanbul in 1987, her weight shifted to one hip, performing the particular boredom of a woman who has already decided how this meeting ends. She was about to learn something about assumption. The terminal chimed. Evelyn Stone straightened in her chair with the quiet authority of someone who has been waiting for this specific moment for 3 years and has no intention of rushing it now that it's arrived. The trust document has 3 attached appendices, Evelyn said. Her voice was neutral in the way that sharpened instruments are neutral. I'll be reading them in sequence. I'd ask that there be no interruptions until I've completed each section. Whitfield looked at Richard. A small look, the kind lawyers exchange when they're recalibrating. Richard gave the smallest nod. He still hadn't sat down. Neither had Eleanor. They were standing like people who intended to leave soon, which I understood was a power posture. You don't sit in a room you plan to own. You stand in it. Arthur's recorded voice returned, and this time there was something different in the texture of it. Still dry, still precise. But underneath, and this is the only way I can describe it, underneath there was the particular weight of a man who has spent years carrying something he was not willing to put down until he was certain it would land correctly. Appendix A, Arthur said, financial disposition. I'll be brief, because the numbers speak with more clarity than I do, and at this point in my life, I have lost patience for decoration. My mother almost smiled. She was expecting numbers. She'd been preparing for numbers. I had watched her, in the 40 minutes before Evelyn arrived, doing the quiet inventory of the room. The first edition shelves, the original Eames chair in the corner, the Tiffany lamp on the reading table that she'd once, when I was 12 and she was still occasionally present, told Arthur she'd always loved. She'd glanced at that lamp twice already this morning. Filed it somewhere in the mental ledger of what she was owed. The Arthur Vance Irrevocable Trust, in its entirety, inclusive of all 17 active biomedical patents, the Beacon Hill property and its contents, all investment accounts, all licensing revenue streams, and all equity positions, is transferred solely and irrevocably to Chloe Marie Vance. The room didn't react immediately. That's the thing about truly significant information. It takes a moment to find the body. It has to travel from the ears down, through the comprehension layer, and into the place where things actually land. I watched it travel through my mother. I watched it hit Eleanor Vance somewhere below her collarbone, watched her chest stop for one half breath, watched her eyes find mine across the room with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not grief, not even anger yet. Calculation, pure, cold recalibration. She was already rerunning the numbers, looking for the error, the loophole, the clause that would make this navigable. Eleanor Vance had been a VP of operations for 11 years. She did not encounter problems. She encountered variables. Richard turned from the window. His jaw had tightened. Not visibly, but I knew that jaw. I had 3 memories of that jaw from childhood that I'd never been able to file away cleanly. He looked at Whitfield with the focused stillness of a man engaging a system he'd paid a great deal of money for. That's the opening position, Richard said. His voice was controlled, practiced. There's obviously a challenge to be made on grounds of Mr. Vance. Evelyn's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. I asked for no interruptions until I've completed each section. We have 2 more appendices. Whitfield put his hand on Richard's arm. A small gesture, the kind that cost $1,100 an hour. Richard stopped. Evelyn looked at her screen. Appendix B. I want to tell you about something Arthur said to me in the lab about 14 months ago, because it matters here. It was late, past 11, and we were cross-referencing clinical outcome data from a licensing negotiation with a medical device company in Chicago. I'd found an anomaly in their reported efficacy numbers, a discrepancy between the peer-reviewed results they'd published and the raw trial data they'd submitted to us for due diligence. 7 percentage points, small enough to miss, large enough to matter enormously in a patent valuation. I flagged it and showed Arthur. He looked at it for a long time, turning his reading glasses over in his fingers the way he did when he was thinking hard. "When someone shows you who they are in a small number," he said finally, "believe the small number. People lie in the large statements. They get careless in the details." He filed the discrepancy, voided the negotiation, and added the company to what he privately called his architectural exclusion list, a record he kept of entities he would never build with again. I thought about that as Evelyn opened Appendix B. I thought about small numbers. I thought about the specific carelessness of people who believe their details will never surface. "Appendix B," Arthur's voice said. "What I'm about to read into this record is not offered in anger. I want to be precise about that. Anger is a reaction. This is a documentation. These are facts organized in the order they occurred, submitted as part of the permanent trust record, and filed simultaneously with the Suffolk County Probate Court as of this morning." Evelyn turned the laptop so its screen faced the room. On it, a cascade of document thumbnails, emails, financial transfer records. A scanned handwritten note on what I could see, even from across the table, was Richard's firm letterhead. My mother made a sound. Not a word. A sound, short and involuntary, the kind the body produces when the mind hasn't caught up yet. 6 years ago, Arthur continued, in the 4th week of March, I received a visit from my son, Richard, and his wife, Eleanor. At that time, I was managing early-stage heart failure, a diagnosis I had not shared publicly, but which Richard was aware of, having accessed my private medical correspondence through our shared family estate account, a breach I documented but chose, at the time, not to act upon. Richard's face did something complicated. The control was still there, but underneath it something had shifted. The specific shift of a man who has just realized the ground he's standing on has different dimensions than he measured. During that visit, Richard presented me with what he framed as a family investment opportunity. He and Eleanor intended to relocate to London to launch a private equity venture. They required seed capital of $4 million. They were requesting this capital as an early inheritance draw to be secured against the estate. Whitfield had stopped writing. His pen was still. He was listening the way lawyers listen when they need to understand the architecture of a problem before they can begin dismantling it. I declined. My reasons were financial and structural. The estate was not liquid in that proportion without compromising the patent licensing infrastructure that funded my ongoing research. Richard was aware of this. He had, as I mentioned, read my private financial correspondence. Arthur paused on the recording. In my 6 years with him, I had come to understand his pauses. They were not hesitation. They were the structural silences of a man who chose each word the way an engineer chooses a load-bearing component. This pause was 3 seconds. Exactly 3. Richard's response to my refusal was to make a counter-proposal. He would agree to transfer full legal guardianship of his daughter Chloe, then 17 years of age, to me, waiving all parental claims and obligations in exchange for the $4 million capital transfer. He committed this proposal to writing. I have retained the original document, which is attached to this appendix as Exhibit C. If you need to stop for a second, stop, because I did. I'm telling you this the way it happened. And the way it happened is that I heard my grandfather's voice, read those words into a cedar-smelling Boston study, while my parents stood 8 feet away from me, and I had to do the thing I'd learned to do in Arthur's lab when data produced a result my nervous system wasn't ready for. I breathed, I grounded my hands flat against my knees, and I let the information be what it was, without collapsing the distance between fact and feeling. I had not known about Exhibit C. Arthur had never told me. I understood now, sitting in that room, why he hadn't. He was protecting the integrity of my 6 years with him. He didn't want me building our relationship on the knowledge of what it had cost. He wanted me to earn it clean, and then he wanted me to know the full truth only when I was standing somewhere solid enough to hold it. He knew me well enough to know I needed to be standing somewhere solid. He'd built me somewhere solid. Deliberately. Over 6 years, like infrastructure. Evelyn clicked to Exhibit C. The scanned document filled the laptop screen. Richard's handwriting at the top, I recognized it from birthday cards with no warmth in them. The firm's letterhead and the paragraph in the middle, which Evelyn now read aloud in the same neutral, sharpened tone because the document was part of the legal record and required verbal entry. In consideration of the capital transfer of $4 million USD from the Arthur Vance estate account to the Vance Ellis Capital Partners Seed Fund, Richard and Eleanor Vance agreed to transfer full custody, guardianship, and parental responsibility for Chloe Marie Vance, DOB March 4th, to Arthur William Vance, effective immediately and without condition. Take Chloe. Consider her custody the final trade for the capital. We're starting fresh. That last sentence was not legal language. That last sentence was Richard dropping the professional register for one line because he was writing to his father and thought the letter would never leave the family. That last sentence was the careless detail in the small number. Take Chloe. Consider her custody the final trade for the capital. We're starting fresh. My mother's hand found the edge of Arthur's desk. Not assessingly this time, steadying. My father said nothing. His face had gone to a place I didn't have a name for. Not shame exactly, because I don't think Richard Vance had the internal architecture for shame in the way most people understand it. It was closer to the expression of an engineer who has just watched a system he designed fail in a way he didn't model for. He hadn't modeled for Arthur. That was the error. He'd looked at an aging man with a failing heart and seen a finite resource, capital, property, patents, without understanding that Arthur Vance had spent 50 years building systems designed to outlast. Human error. Including Richard's. Arthur transferred the $4 million. Evelyn continued, reading from the trust narrative. Under duress and under the explicit condition that Chloe would be provided for. He then spent the following 6 years documenting every financial decision Richard and Eleanor made with that capital, every communication they failed to send to their daughter, and every quarterly psychiatric evaluation confirming his own full cognitive competence, ensuring that when this moment arrived, there would be no ambiguity about either the facts or his soundness of mind in recording them. Whitfield closed his legal pad. Slowly, he looked at the screen for another moment, then at Richard, with the expression of a man who has just completed a structural assessment and determined the building is not salvageable in the current configuration. "I'll need a moment with my clients," he said to Evelyn. "You'll have one," Evelyn said, after Appendix C. The Tiffany lamp on the reading table caught the October light coming through the window. Green and amber glass, the color shifting slightly as a cloud moved outside. My mother had always loved that lamp. She'd said so, once, years ago, in this same room. She wasn't looking at it now. I kept my hands flat on my knees, and I let Arthur's system do what he had built it to do, and I thought about chamomile tea, going cold on a lab bench, and MIT alumni sweatshirts, and a desk in a corner with good light, and the specific weight of being chosen by someone who had no obligation to choose you, and I did not look away from any of it. Evelyn Stone reached for the trackpad. "Appendix C," she said. Evelyn Stone had a specific way of opening a new document section that I had come to recognize over the 3 preparatory meetings Arthur had insisted I attend with her in his final months. She would straighten the laptop screen by exactly 2 degrees, place her right hand flat on the table beside the keyboard, and exhale once, not heavily, not dramatically, just the breath of a person resetting their instrument before the most technically demanding passage of the piece. She did it now. And I knew, watching her do it, that Appendix C was where Arthur had put the mechanism. The first two appendices had been the story. This was the engineering. Appendix C. Arthur's recorded voice said, "I am a biomedical engineer. I have spent 51 years designing systems for one purpose, to function correctly in the exact conditions under which they are most likely to fail. The human body fails under stress. Institutions fail under pressure. Legal instruments fail when the people who constructed them underestimated the intelligence and resources of the people who would challenge them. I did not underestimate. What follows is the operational structure of this trust's protective architecture, constructed over 37 months, beginning from the date of my terminal diagnosis." Whitfield had reopened his legal pad. His pen was moving again, but differently now. Shorter strokes, the handwriting of a man taking structural notes rather than narrative ones. He was no longer listening for the story. He was listening for the load-bearing walls. Richard had finally sat down. I noticed that the way I notice most things. Peripherally. Catalogued. Filed. He sat in the chair to the left of the window, the one with the worn armrest where Arthur used to rest his elbow during long phone calls. I don't know if Richard knew that. Probably not. He sat in it the way people sit in chairs that belong to other people, without acknowledgement, without weight. Eleanor remained standing. Her hand had left the edge of the desk. Both arms were crossed now, and her chin was elevated at an angle I recognized from the 2 parenting conferences she'd attended when I was 9 and 11. The angle of a woman managing the perception of composure, while the interior calculus runs hot. "Layer 1, Arthur said, "the cognitive audit." Evelyn navigated to a new section of the terminal. What loaded on screen was a document index. Clean, tabbed, color-coded, with the particular organizational precision that I had spent 6 years learning to recognize as Arthur's signature. He color-coded by risk category: green for established, amber for contingent, red for anticipated challenge. The cognitive audit folder was green, 44 entries deep. Beginning 37 months ago, I engaged Dr. Priya Mehta, Chief of Neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital, to conduct independent psychiatric evaluations on a quarterly basis. Each evaluation was designed to assess cognitive function, decisional capacity, and the absence of undue external influence on my legal and financial decision-making. Dr. Mehta was selected specifically because she has no professional or personal relationship with any member of the Vance family, has never received compensation from any Vance-affiliated entity, and holds a position of sufficient institutional seniority that her findings carry evidentiary weight in Suffolk County Probate Court that would be, and I choose this word with precision, exceptional. Whitfield looked up from his legal pad. Just briefly, the look of a man recalculating square footage. Each of the 44 sessions was video recorded in full, with audio. Each recording was digitally timestamped and uploaded in real time to a distributed public ledger, a blockchain verification system for those in the room unfamiliar with the architecture, making retroactive alteration of any file mathematically impossible. The recordings document, in full, my cognitive clarity, my awareness of the specific decisions I was making, my awareness of the individuals I was choosing to exclude, and my explicit reasoning for those exclusions, stated on camera at each session. He paused. That 3-second pause again. The final evaluation was conducted 11 days before my death. Dr. Mehta's written conclusion, countersigned by 2 independent neurological consultants, is attached as Exhibit D. I will read its summary finding. Arthur William Vance demonstrates full decisional capacity, orientation to person, place, time, and circumstance, and no evidence of cognitive impairment, delusional ideation, or susceptibility to external influence. His estate planning decisions reflect consistent, coherent, and long-held intentions documented across 37 months of evaluation. Any claim of diminished mental capacity as grounds for challenging this trust would require contradicting 44 video-recorded sessions, 3 independent physicians, and a blockchain-verified documentary record. Such a claim would not survive preliminary hearing. Whitfield put his pen down, not dramatically. He simply placed it on the legal pad with the careful stillness of a man who has just read the structural report and understood what it means for the project timeline. Richard's eyes moved to him. Whitfield didn't return the look immediately. He was reading the document index on the screen. The 44 green-tabbed folders, each one a quarterly session, each one a time-stamped brick in a wall that had been under construction for 3 years, while Richard was in London running capital through a firm that Arthur, as it would shortly become clear, had never entirely let go of. Here's what I want you to understand about Arthur Vance, and about the kind of mind that builds something like this. He was not a vindictive man. I want to be precise about that, the same way he was always precise. In 6 years, I never heard him express satisfaction at another person's failure. I never heard him speak about Richard or Eleanor with hatred. What I heard occasionally in the lab late at night when the work had gone long and the defenses were lower was a specific, exhausted grief. The grief of a man who had watched his son become a particular kind of person and understood, with the clarity of an engineer, that the structure had failed at the foundation and no amount of surface repair would correct it. He didn't build this apparatus to punish Richard. He built it because he understood that Richard would come, and that when Richard came, he would bring a Whitfield, and that the only language a Whitfield responds to is a structure he cannot dismantle. Arthur built in the language Richard would send. He just built it better. That's the thing about spending 50 years designing systems. You get very good at anticipating failure modes. If you've ever watched someone you love build something quietly, patiently, without telling you the full scope of it, and then understood it all at once, after they were gone, you know what that room felt like for me. Drop a comment. I mean that. Layer 2, Arthur said, the disinheritance trigger. Evelyn navigated to the next section. This folder was amber-tabbed, contingent, dependent on what happened in this room. Richard and Eleanor Vance are each designated a mandatory disbursement of $10,000 from the estate. This designation is intentional and serves a specific legal function. It establishes, irrevocably, that their omission from the primary trust distribution was deliberate and considered, not accidental or the result of oversight. They were not forgotten. They were excluded. The distinction is architecturally significant. Eleanor's arms tightened across her chest. The movement was small, a degree of compression, the physical equivalent of a system bracing for load. The trust contains a no-contest clause, commonly referred to in estate law as an in terrorem provision. The specific terms of this provision are as follows. Should Richard Vance, Eleanor Vance, or any agent acting on their behalf file any legal challenge to this trust, including but not limited to claims of undue influence, diminished testamentary capacity, improper execution, or fraudulent inducement, the clause triggers an immediate cross-default mechanism affecting all financial instruments in which I retain an interest connected to their current holdings. Whitfield was very still. I will be specific, because specificity is the point. 6 years ago, when I transferred $4 million to Richard's venture under the conditions documented in Appendix B, I did not simply release the capital. As a condition of that transfer, a condition embedded in the wire transfer agreement, which Richard signed and which is attached as Exhibit E, I retained the underlying debt certificates on the London property portfolio used as collateral for the venture's first-year operating leverage. In plain terms, I own the debt on Richard and Eleanor's London penthouse and on the firm's primary commercial lease. I have owned it for 6 years. I have not called it. That was a choice. Another pause. This one, longer than 3 seconds. 5. The longest Arthur pause I had ever heard on any of his recordings. The no contest clause calls it automatically. If a challenge is filed, the cross-default provision triggers within 72 hours. The debt certificates are transferred to the estate, which is to say, to Chloe. And the foreclosure process on both properties initiates under Massachusetts and UK bilateral debt enforcement agreements, which I have already confirmed with counsel in both jurisdictions are fully applicable to this structure. I have also confirmed the timeline. 72 hours to trigger, 14 days to foreclosure initiation. Richard's firm has no secondary collateral position. Eleanor's personal guarantees on the commercial lease are uncapped. He stopped. Then, with the particular dry precision that was the most Arthur thing I had ever heard. If they sue, they will be bankrupt before the preliminary hearing is scheduled. I did the arithmetic. I thought they should know I did the arithmetic. Whitfield stood up. He did it slowly, with the deliberate physical economy of a man who has trained himself never to move in a way that communicates distress. He buttoned his jacket, he picked up his pen and placed it in his interior pocket. He lifted his briefcase from the side table and set it on the chair he'd been occupying, released the clasps, and looked at the interior for a moment. At whatever documents he'd prepared in anticipation of a challenge he was now understanding he could not make. Then he closed it. The sound of those clasps engaging was the cleanest sound in the room. He looked at Richard. Not with apology. Whitfield was not a man who apologized at $1,100 an hour for the limitations of a situation. He looked at Richard with the flat, professional assessment of a man who has completed his structural analysis and is preparing to communicate the findings. The cognitive audit record is unimpeachable, Whitfield said quietly. 44 sessions, blockchain verified, countersigned by Mass General Neurology. No probate judge in Suffolk County will schedule a capacity hearing against that volume of documentation. The filing costs alone would be substantial, and the preliminary outcome is not in question. Richard's jaw was doing the thing I remembered, the tightening, the internal recalculation running behind still eyes. And the debt instruments? Richard said. His voice was controlled, just barely. If they're structured the way the trust describes, and I have no reason to believe they aren't, given everything else in this document, then filing anything triggers the foreclosure sequence automatically. It's a cross default. I can't stop a cross default once it's triggered. Whitfield looked at his briefcase. The London office is on the commercial lease? Yes, Richard said. Then the firm goes with the penthouse. He said it without particular inflection, just the weight of fact, cleanly delivered. If you file, you lose both properties and the operating base of the firm within the foreclosure window. There's no litigation strategy that resolves faster than 14 days. Eleanor turned toward the window, away from the room. The back of her neck was rigid, the tendons in it defined and sharp, the posture of a body holding something at maximum tension. This is designed, Richard said, not to Whitfield specifically, to the room, to the document, to the cedar-smelling air and the October light and the voice of his dead father, which had just finished speaking with the calm, total authority of someone who had spent 37 months making absolutely certain this moment went exactly this way. He designed this specifically to, yes, Evelyn said, just that, just yes, because there was nothing else required. The room held for a moment, 5 people and the afterimage of a 6th, a man in a MIT sweatshirt with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, who had opened a door to a 17-year-old with 2 suitcases and asked her if she liked data, and then spent 6 years quietly, methodically, without fanfare or self-congratulation, building a system to make sure she would be standing on solid ground when this day came. I looked at the Tiffany lamp, green and amber, the October light moving through it. I did not cry, not because I wasn't feeling it. I was feeling all of it, every layer, the grief and the gratitude and the strange, stabilizing weight of being known completely by someone who was no longer in the room. I didn't cry because Arthur had taught me, not in words, but in the daily practice of the lab, that precise feeling and precise function are not opposites. You can hold something enormous and still keep your hand steady. You can carry the full arithmetic of a thing and still read the output clearly. I kept my hands flat on my knees. I read the output. Eleanor turned back from the window. Her face had reorganized itself into something I didn't have a clean name for. It wasn't the calculation from before, and it wasn't grief, and it wasn't quite rage. It was the specific expression of a person who has spent a long time constructing a version of events in which they are not the architect of their own consequences, and who has just been placed in a room where that construction will not hold. She looked at me, and Eleanor Vance, VP of Operations, who had flown in from London in wool and full makeup to collect an inheritance she had not earned and had not thought to question her right to, said the thing she had perhaps been carrying for 6 years, the thing that had always been the actual content beneath the Christmas cards with no notes inside, beneath the birthday texts sent at odd hours like afterthoughts, beneath the specific quality of her silence across 6 years of her daughter growing up in someone else's house. She said it to me, across the mahogany desk that still smelled like the man she had helped drive away from her own family, in front of Evelyn Stone and Whitfield, and the laptop screen full of 44 green-tabbed folders, and her husband who was sitting in a chair that wasn't his. You were always just a tax write-off to us anyway. Whitfield closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Evelyn Stone looked up from her terminal. I looked at my mother. I didn't respond. I want you to understand that clearly. I didn't respond, not because I had nothing to say, but because Arthur had also taught me this. When a system produces its final output, you don't argue with the output. You document it. You let it be what it is. You let it stand in the record. Eleanor Vance had just placed her final output into the legal record of the Arthur Vance Irrevocable Trust in front of 2 attorneys and a blockchain-verified documentary apparatus built by a man who had understood 37 months ago that this was exactly the kind of thing that needed to be witnessed. Whitfield picked up his briefcase. "I'll be in the car," he said to Richard. He didn't say goodbye to Evelyn. He didn't look at me. He walked to the study door with the particular pace of a man who has fulfilled the technical requirements of his engagement and is no longer billable. The door opened. The door closed. The room held the silence he left behind. Richard and Eleanor left without ceremony. That's the part I want you to hold on to, because I think most people expect a moment like this to have more shape to it. A door slam, a final accusation. Some last architecture of noise that marks the occasion as significant, but that's not what happened. What happened was quieter and, in its quietness, more complete than anything loud could have been. Richard stood from Arthur's chair. He straightened his jacket with the automatic precision of a man whose body has been trained to perform composure regardless of interior condition. He looked at me once, not long, not with any particular identifiable emotion, and then looked away, toward the window, toward Beacon Hill, outside it, toward the city that had watched Arthur Vance build something over 50 years that his son had spent considerably less time trying to dismantle. Eleanor had already moved toward the door, her heels on Arthur's hardwood floor. 4 steps. 5. The sound diminishing. Richard followed. The study door closed behind them with the same soft click it had made every evening for 6 years, when Arthur finished work and the house settled into its nighttime quiet. An ordinary sound. The most ordinary sound in the world, in that room. I sat with it for a moment. Evelyn Stone began the process of closing and encrypting the terminal with the methodical care she brought to everything. She didn't speak immediately, and I was grateful for that. She was the kind of person who understood that silence after significant events isn't emptiness, it's load-bearing. "There's one more thing," she said finally. From Arthur, not part of the trust record. She reached into her document case and placed a small object on the mahogany desk between us. A titanium key token, roughly the size and weight of a USB drive, but solid, machined, precise, the kind of object that communicates its own seriousness through material alone. Engraved along its face, in characters small enough to require the reading glasses I'd borrowed from Arthur's desk 100 times, 42.3601 degrees north, MIT apex, his first patent's coordinates. The beginning of everything he'd built. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, the way significant things often are. Arthur's private server was in the basement lab. I'd worked in that lab for 6 years and never accessed the server directly. It had always been his domain, the one partition of the house's architecture he maintained sole access to. I understood now that this was intentional. He'd been building something in there that needed to remain unobserved until the right moment, which was this moment, which he had known would come because he had engineered the conditions for it with the same patience he brought to everything he engineered. The basement stairs were familiar under my feet, the specific creak on the third step, the smell changing as I descended. Less cedar, more lab, the cool chemical and metal atmosphere of the workspace, where I had learned most of what I knew about data architecture, patent systems, and the particular discipline of building things designed to last. The server cabinet was in the back corner behind the primary workstation. A matte black enclosure, standard-looking, the kind you wouldn't look at twice. There was a single port on the front panel, the exact profile of the key token in my hand. I inserted it. The screen on the workstation woke. A simple interface, text only, white on dark, the aesthetic of someone who considered visual decoration an inefficiency. One folder, labeled with my name. Inside, a single text file, and beneath it, a directory. Patent documentation, research files, licensing structures, financial architecture, the complete internal map of everything Arthur had built, organized with the color-coded precision I knew as well as my own handwriting by now. I opened the text file. Chloe, if you're reading this, Evelyn did her job, and so did the system. Good. I want to tell you something I should have said with more frequency when I had the opportunity, and which I am telling you now because I have run out of opportunities, and I find I'm unwilling to let the omission stand. You came to this house at 17 with 2 suitcases, and the specific expression of someone who has been told, in ways both direct and architectural, that they are not the point. I recognized that expression. I had seen it in research fellows passed over for grants they'd earned, in colleagues whose work was absorbed into other people's bylines, in patients whose charts told a different story than their symptoms. The expression of a person who has started to believe the accounting of people who never did the actual count. You are the most capable research mind I worked with in 51 years. I include colleagues with endowed chairs and published bodies of work in that assessment. You organized 17 years of patent data in 4 months. You identified the Chicago efficacy discrepancy that 3 of my senior advisors had missed. You rewrote the licensing framework for the neurovascular patents in your 2nd year and increased the revenue yield by 31%. You did all of this while managing a household, managing my care, and managing, with a grace I did not always acknowledge, the specific ongoing grief of a person whose parents had made their valuation of her explicit. I did not tell you enough that I saw all of this. That is my failure, and I own it precisely. The lab is yours. The patents are yours. The capital is yours. Not as inheritance, as proof of delivery. You built this value. The legal structure simply confirms what the work already established. One instruction. Keep building, not for them, not to prove anything to the room we just left behind. Build because you are an engineer now, and engineers build because the alternative is to let things fall that don't need to fall. The directory contains everything. Start with the neurovascular licensing pipeline. There are two negotiations I left intentionally incomplete because I wanted you to finish them your way. 42.3601 degrees north. That's where I started. You'll find your own coordinates. Arthur. I read it twice. Then I sat in the lab chair, my chair, the one with the good light, the one he'd placed in the corner on my first week in the house, and I let it be what it was. I didn't perform anything. There was no one to perform for. It was just me and the server and the cool lab air and the weight of a titanium key token in my palm and 6 years of chamomile tea going cold on a bench and a man in a MIT sweatshirt asking a 17-year-old with 2 suitcases if she liked data. I stayed in that chair for a long time. Then I opened the neurovascular licensing directory, and I got to work. 2 years later, the Apex Way Foundation opened its Boston headquarters on a Thursday in early November in a renovated building 4 blocks from Arthur's brownstone, close enough that on clear days you could see the corner of his roofline from the front steps. The building had 12 residential units for emancipated foster youth and abandoned teenagers, a full technology training center, partnership agreements with 3 Boston area universities for scholarship placement, and a data lab on the second floor with good light in every corner. The Foundation's first cohort was 11 young people between the ages of 17 and 22. At the opening reception, I stood at the front of the room and looked at them, at their specific, careful expressions, the ones I recognized because I had worn that expression myself, in a different city, in a different room, with 2 suitcases. And I said the only thing I knew how to say that was true enough to be worth saying. Someone built something for you, I told them. Your job is to learn how it works, and then build something better. The biomedical firm had scaled to 31 employees by then. The neurovascular licensing negotiations I'd completed in my first month had yielded a contract that restructured the revenue pipeline for the next decade. 2 of Arthur's incomplete research threads had produced a co-authored paper, my name first on the byline, that was currently under review at a journal Arthur had published in 4 times over his career. Richard and Eleanor's London penthouse had quietly entered receivership 8 months after the will reading, the result of a leveraged position unwinding without the capital base to sustain it. The firm had contracted significantly. I knew this not because I'd tracked it, but because Evelyn had mentioned it once, briefly, and I had filed it and moved on. I had not contacted them. I did not intend to. What they had done with their portion of the story was their arithmetic to carry. I had my own calculations to run, and they were more interesting, and they were building toward something, and I did not have the hours to spend on an accounting that was already closed. On the night of the foundation opening, after the cohort had gone to their rooms and the last of the staff had left, I sat alone in the second-floor data lab with the lights low and the Boston skyline pressing orange and amber through the windows. I held the titanium key token. I'd carried it every day since Evelyn placed it on the mahogany desk. It was warm now, from being in my pocket, the temperature of something that has been held a long time. 42.3601 degrees north, MIT Apex, where he started. I opened my laptop and pulled up the coordinates of the building I was sitting in. The Apex Way Foundation. Boston, the corner of the block Arthur had identified 2 years before his death as the right location for this specific purpose. I'd found the property search in the server directory, time-stamped from 30 months ago. He'd picked it before he told me anything. He'd been building toward this too, parallel to everything else. In the quiet, methodical way he built all things. I noted the coordinates. I wrote them in the margin of the lab notebook I'd started the week I moved into the brownstone, the first of 11 notebooks now shelved in order on the desk to my left. My coordinates, the place where I continued. I closed the notebook. I looked at the city. I got back to work.